Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started with our presentation today. I would like to welcome you to the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative Winter Webinar Series. This is the second of 3 talks that we have lined up presented by researchers engaged in the science and practice of prairie reconstruction. My name is Jamie Ellis, and I work as the Natural Areas Coordinator at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and I serve on the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative Advisory Team. Thank you for joining us today. This session is being recorded and will be available through the PRI website and uploaded to YouTube as well. I kindly ask that you keep your connections muted during the session. If you have questions during the talk, if you have questions for our speaker today, please type them into the chat. And then at the end, we'll do our best to read through them, and our speaker I'm sure will be happy to entertain and answer all of your questions. Of course, time, depending on the time and timing as well. But before I introduce our speaker, one of Becky Esser will tell you a little bit about the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative. Becky, I think you're on the line out there, right?
Yes, I am.
Oh, wonderful.
I'm here. Thank you, Jamie. All right, everyone. Well, PRI is a community of prairie reconstruction practitioners and researchers from more than 30 organizations working together to improve our prairie reconstructions so that they are biologically diverse, are ecologically functional, and resist invasion by non-native plants. We focus all of our activities within 2 general areas. These are evidence-based tools and peer-to-peer learning. Our tools include a vegetation monitoring protocol and a prairie reconstruction database for collecting a standard suite of data about our reconstructions. By pooling and analyzing data from many reconstructions, we hope to reveal pivotal elements that will increase the likelihood that all reconstructions meet expectations. Our learning opportunities include both in-person and online events such as this, where the PRI community can exchange experiences and knowledge with each other. We believe these insights from both individual experiences and scientific investigation lead to our collective success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Becky, for telling us a bit about Prairie Reconstruction Initiative. And I want to thank Amanda put a link to the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative website into the chat. And now I am very happy to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Bach. Dr. Bach is the research scientist at the Nachusa Grasslands Preserve, where she works with scientists, land managers, and volunteer stewards to investigate questions about tallgrass prairie restoration or ecology. Her own research expertise focuses on soil ecology, exploring how below-ground biology supports tallgrass prairie ecosystems through plant-soil interactions and nutrient and carbon cycling. Prior to joining the Nature Conservancy in 2018, Elizabeth served as the executive director for the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative and continues to contribute to global science policy work. She has a master's of science in plant biology from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Iowa State University. So Elizabeth, I will stop presenting on my end so that you can share your screen on your end. And so thank you and welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you all for being here. It's really an honor to be joining you all virtually from the Nachusa Grasslands Preserve and sharing this work broadly throughout the tallgrass prairie region. hold on. There we go. Nachusa Grasslands is located on the homelands of the Peoria, Meskwaki, Sauk, Ochequishakawan, Miami, Kickapoo, and Potawatomi people. The people of these cultures and nations, both past and present, are an integral part of the tallgrass prairie and savanna ecosystems on this landscape. Their stewardship, including regular use of fire, encouragement of grazing, and agricultural practices, was central to the evolution of this ecosystem and continues to shape that system today. Today, currently, Nachusa Grasslands is owned and managed by the Nature Conservancy in Illinois, whom I'm honored to work with, and am incredibly grateful to their support for the work that's been happening at this preserve over 35 plus years. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues here at the preserve, Bill Kleiman, Cody Considine, as well as our annual seasonal field crews who do so much of the work on the ground here. It's a wonderful team to be part of. I also want to acknowledge Dee Hudson and Charles Larry, two stalwart volunteers, and Dee also works with us part-time. They are both incredibly talented photographers, and you're going to see several of their beautiful images throughout my talk today, and I just wanted to give them an extra special shout out. I also want to acknowledge several scientists who are graciously allowing me to share their data with you as part of this talk, and you'll see their names as we get to it. Pete Guyden, Holly Jones, Nick Barber, and Jen Chakravorty. For those of you who may not know, and that may be most of you, Nachusa Grasslands is a preserve in north central Illinois. We're located about 100 miles west of the Chicago region. We're also about 100 miles south of Madison, Wisconsin. The preserve is open to the public, so if you're ever in the area passing by on Interstate 39 or Interstate 88, please stop by and see us. The preserve is set up to welcome visitors and permit hiking through large portion of it. The Nature Conservancy began the Nachusa Grasslands project in the mid-1980s with the purchase of a few hundred acres, most of which was actually remnant unplowed tallgrass prairie located on some sandy hilltops, as well as some adjacent agricultural land. From that beginning, as I said, almost 35 years ago, today the preserve is over 4,000 acres, and most of that is reconstructed tallgrass prairie that has been planted into former agricultural fields. It does include some additional sandy hilltop remnant prairies, which will make an appearance later in this talk, as well as some areas that we categorize as savanna, where it does have more presence of oak hickory trees and a partially open canopy. The preserve is home to over 700 native plant species, 250 bird species, 270 bee species, and yes, that is a lot of bees, and a herd of 100 bison, which were reintroduced in 2014. Today, I'm honored to share with you three science stories that have come out of Nachusa Grasslands recently and are ongoing in our long-term science work. The first is an overview of 20 years of plant community monitoring and what we've learned across that long-term data set. The second will look at the impacts of the bison reintroduction on plant communities within the first 5 years of that reintroduction. Excuse me. And then lastly, as my colleagues who work with wildlife like to remind me, prairies are more than just plants. We'll focus on some research coming out of Nachusa, looking at animal communities and how they respond to prairie reconstruction and restoration. When my boss, Bill Kleiman, came to Nachusa as the first project director in the mid-1990s, he knew this was the kind of project that he wanted to be able to know how the reconstruction and restoration efforts were impacting the plant community, were impacting the ecosystem. And in order to try and have some sort of evidence to support the work that was being done. He collaborated with some botanists in the Northern Illinois, Greater Chicago region. In this photo here from 1996, we see Gerald Wilhelm in the blue shirt and Linda Masters in the white t-shirt. They, among others, worked with Bill and set up a series of transects across the preserve and have added transects as the preserve grew in size, and have revisited and collected data along those transects multiple times in the intervening years. When I came to Nachusa in 2018, I knew that this was a really opportune data set. This was an area where I wanted to prioritize digitizing this data, synthesizing it, and publishing it to really understand what lessons we've learned from restoration and to see how this project has unfolded across 20 years. In that process, I was able to identify 12 transects across the preserve, shown on the map here. And somewhat fortuitously, 4 of those transects are located on native prairie remnants, these sandy hilltop remnants I mentioned earlier. 4 of these transects are located on what we characterize as savanna habitat, more open-grown oak hickory savanna. When the Nature Conservancy acquired those units, they tended to be heavily overgrown with brush, and so we've done some extensive restoration work in those areas. And then 4 of those transects were on planted, reconstructed prairies that were planted into former ag fields, typically soybean or corn. All of these habitats have received extensive restoration and reconstruction efforts. As I mentioned, the planted prairies were planted into agricultural fields and receive regular kind of aggressive invasive species management, regular prescribed fire throughout their history. The savanna habitats typically received some strong management to remove brush, both mechanically and chemically, and to open up those understories being the goal in that work. The savannas also receive frequent prescribed fire on the preserve, and in fact, those units get the most frequent fire return interval. And the native prairie remnants received, we tend to treat those with a light touch. They're pretty wonderful habitat. They do get regular prescribed fire. We've reinstituted that. Most of the units at Nachusa are receiving fire every 2 to 3 years. The remnants, it might be more like every 4 years, 3 to 4 years. In pulling together these data, I learned that the way that cover had been estimated varied a little bit from year to year, depending on who was collecting the data. So for the data I'm sharing with you today, I synthesized it all as presence-absence data. So keep that in mind. I had a little limitation in being able to interpret abundance of these plants. And I also leaned on a value, the coefficient of conservatism. Now, many of you may be very familiar with this value, but I like to just level set with all audiences that I give this talk to. The coefficient of conservatism is a value that's assigned to plants, usually by local experts, that represents its affinity for undisturbed habitat. And this is often interpreted as a metric of rarity. Plants with a higher coefficient of conservatism are found in areas with very low levels of disturbance and are typically thought of as representing remnant or very high quality habitat areas. So generally, higher values represent better quality habitat. With these data, I set out to answer 2 kind of questions that I think they're pretty simple, but as sure all of you know, these can get pretty complex when you start digging into them. The first being, are management practices sustaining plant diversity, including rare plants in native prairies and savannas? And secondly, do reconstructed prairies support comparable levels of plant diversity and conservatism compared to native prairies? So I'm going to begin by showing you the native prairie data. I'm going to show you several slides like this, so I'm going to set this one up for you. This is a visualization of the plant community. Some of you may be incredibly familiar with these types of graphs, others may not be. The big thing you need to know is that dots that are closer to each other on this graph have more similar plant communities. They share more similar species. And what I've done here is each of the different transects located on native prairies are indicated by a different color. So the green one is a different transect from the purple one. And the gradient of those colors represents the repeated measures over years. So the bolder dot represents the earliest measurement, usually in 1994 for these data. And the lighter or more translucent color represents the more recent sampling, probably 2015 or 2013 for most of these. As you can see, the native prairie remnants are actually very distinct from each other. One of the big take-homes here is the plant community in these 4 particular native prairies are very different from each other. And we are seeing that those communities are shifting over time, as you can see those dots of the same color family separating from each other. When we dig in and look at metrics like total plant species across the top line here, we see that one of those native prairie plant communities did show an increase in total plant species. The others didn't show any change. In the middle line, we're looking at the proportion of native species. And you'll note that that's pretty high for most of these remnants, near 100%, if not actually 100%. And what we see here is that that percentage is not changing over time. So that means, for example, in P19, where we saw an increase in total plant species, these aren't weedy non-native plants moving into those remnants. These are native plants recruited into the system. And then the bottom line shows this mean C, this mean coefficient of conservatism or measure of rarity. And we can see that in one of these native prairie transects, we did see an increase in that overall mean coefficient of conservatism across the 20 years of data represented in these graphs. Moving on to the savanna habitat, what we see here, again, each of these color families is a different transect. The savanna transects are much more similar to each other than we noticed with those native prairies. You see they're more clustered in this graph. But we did see these changes across time in the savanna prairie, similar to what we saw in the native prairie, savanna habitat, sorry. When we looked at these metrics of plant diversity, total plant species richness, proportion of native plant species, and this mean coefficient of conservatism, we saw no statistical change in these values across any of these savanna habitats. However, from working on the ground, we knew there was a little bit more to the story here. So I dug in and I ran what are called indicator species analyses. And what this told me was that the surveys for these transects done in the mid-90s, the species that were most likely to be found in those transects in the mid-90s included things like honeysuckle, Virginia creeper, and poison ivy, your typical kind of mesic, brushy, invaded understory. In contrast, the surveys that were done in the mid-2010s, the most recent surveys done, we saw a shift in the plant community where we were more likely to see plants like native goldenrods, sedges, and Joe pieweed. And so what we're actually seeing in the savannas here is a substitution, and that structurally is definitely changing these systems, as you can see from the photo. But the kind of undesired non-native brushy plants are being replaced by herbaceous understory plants, some of which are native, some aren't, but aren't necessarily invaders that we're particularly worried about. And interestingly, that coefficient of conservatism is also just showing a substitution. So habitat-wise, we feel like we're accomplishing our goals. We're structurally flipping a dense understory into a more open, herbaceous dominated understory. And this is a good example of cases where these broad metrics of plant diversity can sometimes not tell you the whole story. So finally, the planted prairies, the reconstructed prairies. So in this situation, I actually had to use a 3-dimensional graph to visualize these communities. And I know that's complicated. So what we're looking at here is if pretend like you have like a glass box and maybe there's like a little flower model in the middle of that glass box. And you can look at the box from this angle, or this angle, and your eyes can figure out that that's a flower in the middle of that glass box. What we're doing here with this visualization is we're looking at this plot from this angle, and this angle, You can see the separation and closeness of these data points from a couple different angles. And what you can see is, again, there's some separation between these transects, but they actually are much more similar, again, than we saw in the native prairie remnants. But you can see these changes over time in these planted prairies as well. So the take-home message is very similar. We just had to visualize it a little differently. And when we look at these metrics of plant diversity, we saw no changes in total plant species in these planted reconstructed prairies over time. The proportion of native species in the oldest planting on the preserve, which was done in 1987, we did see a statistical increase in that proportion of native species. And for the two oldest plantings, the 87 and 1988 plantings, we saw an increase in that mean coefficient of conservatism. So these are all good things that we're looking for. The second question, looking at how the native prairies stack up compared to the planted reconstructed prairies. So again, we're looking at one of these visualizations from 3 different angles. The warm colors, the reds and yellows, are native prairie transects, and the cool colors, the blues, are planted reconstructed prairies. And you can see from these angles that there is some distinction between the planted and reconstructed prairies. And I also invite you to recognize that we see again that spread across the native prairie remnants and actually a tighter clustering amongst the planted prairies, meaning that these are more similar to each other. The planted prairies are more similar to each other than the 4 remnants are. And when we kind of stack these plant diversity metrics next to each other, we can see that particularly the proportion of native species is higher in those native prairie remnants, and that mean coefficient of conservatism is higher in those native prairie remnants. So in answering our questions, are management practices sustaining plant diversity, including rare plants in native prairies and savannas? Yes, absolutely. We're seeing that those communities are maintaining their diverse nature. In some cases, they're increasing. That restoration work is working. And in our reconstructions, we're seeing that as well, that we're recruiting native species and rare native species into those communities. Our secondary question, do restored prairies support comparable levels of plant diversity and conservatism to native prairies? The answer to that one is not quite. No, we do see a distinction between our native prairie remnants and the planted reconstructed prairies. And I think this, together brings us to a conclusion where our native prairies are really important. And conserving prairies, definitely we need to prioritize protecting what few remnants we have left, particularly in a state like Illinois, where there isn't much left. And that restoration and reconstruction together with conservation can work together to achieve strong habitat goals. So both are good, and we need both players on that team, so to speak. All of the plant data that I've shared with you so far actually predates the reintroduction of bison to Nachusa Grasslands. So for the second portion of this talk, I want to focus a little bit on what we've observed since reintroducing the bison. The Nature Conservancy decided to reintroduce bison at Nachusa. This was the result of many years of thinking deeply and digging into the science around the importance of bison as a keystone species in tallgrass prairie. And in 2014, the preserve welcomed the first bison. They came in the fall of 2014, so 2015 was the first growing season that they were grazing. The bison have access to about a third of Nachusa Grasslands. It's about 1,500 acres. We maintain that herd size at about 100 adults, and then calves come on every spring. In deciding to bring bison back to Nachusa, it was really important to my colleagues to be able to evaluate what was the impact of bison and how are they really affecting the ecosystem here at Nachusa. So this set up kind of 3 alternative hypotheses that our team was working with. Hypothesis 1, based on a lot of scientific literature, was that bison grazing would increase plant diversity by suppressing dominant grasses, which they seem to have a preference for grazing. An alternative to that hypothesis is that bison grazing could decrease plant diversity through grazing and disturbance. And then there was actually more of a null hypothesis where bison grazing might have no impact on plant diversity. So these are the three contrasting hypotheses that we wanted to test. And at the time of doing this, my colleagues, Bill and Cody, worked with Dr. John Taft at the Illinois Natural History Survey and Dr. Sarah Baer, who was at Southern Illinois University at the time. She's now at University of Kansas. And they came up with this experimental design of putting 22 bison exclosures across the preserve to document plant community changes. And in 2019, I was able to bring on board a graduate student from University of Wisconsin-Madison, Jen Chakraborty, to complete the year 5 data and help synthesize the first 5 years of data from these exclosures. So what's a bison exclosure? An exclosure is a fenced area where the bison aren't able to graze inside that fence. So this was kind of a rainy day, but you can see the fence here, no grazing inside the fence, yes grazing outside the fence. And these are set up with 3 parallel transects inside the fence and 3 parallel transects outside the fence to compare and contrast grazed and ungrazed areas. And we were able to collect data, baseline data, and by we, I guess I mean others, collected it in the pre-bison data. So we have year 0. We know what these communities looked like before any bison set their hooves on Nachusa Grassland. And then we've been able to revisit them. In this talk, I'll be talking about the year 3 and year 5 data to track these changes. And this allows us to track the bison impact, but also the changes over time because we have that baseline data. So looking at Shannon diversity, this metric of plant diversity, we found no differences between grazed and ungrazed plots across these exclosures. You'll see that we're representing each of these habitat types a little bit differently, in part because those plant communities are pretty different across habitats, but no impact on overall plant diversity with grazing. We found a few trends that are interesting to keep in mind. This one, we were looking at the ratio of non-native to native plants. And we did find a trend towards a slightly higher non-native to native ratio in the grazed areas. This is not statistically significant. And I also want to emphasize this was present in the baseline data before bison. This is actually representing some differences between those plots that we knew about before the bison grazing. But this is certainly a trend that we're watching and are interested to observe. And I also want to emphasize, we only saw this in a couple of the habitat types, the new and the old planted prairies. We weren't observing that in the remnant prairie or savanna prairie. We also saw a trend with the grass to forb ratio in the savannas. The grazed plots had a slightly higher grass to forb ratio. Again, this also is represented in the pre-bison baseline data, and it's a trend that we're looking to examine over time. It is currently not statistically significant. And then when we look at these overall communities, what you see here is these habitat types have very different plant communities as expected. This pink is representing a few wetland habitats we have. The blue is the savanna. The green is the remnant prairie. And then here's our reconstructed or replanted prairies. The yellow's older restorations. The pink is newer restoration. So you can see a strong distinction between all of these habitat types, but within them, no difference between grazed or ungrazed. So the big take-home message here is bison grazing has little to no impact on plant community, at least in the first 5 years at Nachusa. And that supported the null hypothesis. Now, this is a little bit different than some of the data that's in the scientific literature. So this is some work, that my good friends and colleagues at Kanza Prairie have shown, where bison grazing did increase plant diversity within the first 5 years of that reintroduction. We didn't observe that trend at Nachusa, and there's a variety of reasons that may be. One may be just the fact that Illinois receives a lot more moisture. We have a kind of just a different climate envelope around our prairie, and that may play a role. It's also noting that kind of the starting point for plant diversity in Nachusa was at a slightly higher level. And so it could be that we're kind of reaching that some potential limit on plant diversity in prairie systems, and the grazing's making less of an impact. And it's also true that, Kanza is in a landscape context of intact remnant grasslands, and Nachusa is in a context of cornfields. So all of the plant diversity at Nachusa is here or is introduced by managers planting it. And so there's not a lot of, new plants to recruit into that community. We are, of course, interested in seeing how this might pan out over the long term. Kanza has a beautiful 20-year data set, 30-year data set on their bison grazing, and they saw that trend become more and more distinct across those 30 years. And so we're hopeful that over the next 10, 15, 20 years at Nachusa, we'll be collecting the data, and if we see any patterns emerge over time, I'll be excited to come back and tell you about those in the future. So finally, we're going to pull away from the plant community a little bit and talk a little bit about how the animal community is responding to these reconstructed prairies and restored habitat. And this is work that is entirely led by scientists engaged at Nachusa. I can take no credit for it, but I'm really excited to share it with you all this afternoon. Pete Giddon, who's now an assistant professor at Hamilton College in New York, led this work when he was a postdoc working with Holly Jones at Northern Illinois University and Nick Barber at San Diego State University. And you can see here their lab groups support a team of phenomenal graduate students, postdocs, and undergrads who all contributed to collecting data and engaging around this work. The goal of this synthesis was to contrast or to look at how ecosystem management and plant diversity played a role in restoration of animal communities in prairies. For the purpose of this study, when they're talking about management, the three factors that they looked at were the age of planting for these reconstructed prairies, time since the last prescribed fire, in the presence of bison grazing or not. And the key questions that this team was asking was, how does prairie restoration affect animal biodiversity? And is animal biodiversity shaped by management or by plant communities? And to do this, they wanted to look at these direct effects of management actions and these impacts of plant biodiversity. They set this up as the field of dreams hypothesis. If you build it through a diverse plant community, will the animal community come? Will they follow? To examine these questions, this team looked at multiple biological communities in the prairie. They did plant community surveys, small mammal live trapping, snake coverboard trapping, and pitfall traps for select invertebrates. Over the course of the study, they examined 278 different species from 5 distinct communities. So a tremendous amount of work went into this over years and across taxa. And they put this all together using structural equation modeling. Now, I'm not going to send you all down that statistical rabbit hole this afternoon, but essentially this is an approach that allows the team to test direct effects of factors like management or plant diversity on animal biodiversity, but also test for indirect effects. So maybe management actions affected plant diversity, which affected animal biodiversity. And then they're able to actually estimate the size and magnitude of these interactions. So it helps you contrast which were the strongest factors influencing those animal communities. And they did look at animal biodiversity through two different lenses, taxonomic and phylogenetic. So the phylogenetic includes, are you recruiting a whole bunch of new folks from the aster family, which would be represented in taxonomic diversity, or are you getting asters plus legumes plus Liliaceae or additional plant families? Okay, on to the actual results. This is looking at the impacts of plant diversity on that animal taxonomic diversity. And there were effects from that plant community. We see here that the age of restoration certainly influenced plant diversity across these different kind of diversity lenses. Age tended to negatively impact taxonomic diversity in terms of total species number, but positively impacted phylogenetic diversity and functional diversity. So this is kind of showing a filtering of that plant community to represent actually a fairly diverse community with representation across plant families. In turn, these plant diversity metrics influenced animal taxonomic diversity. Positively for snakes and small mammals and certain ground beetles from the taxonomic and functional lens, negatively through the phylogenetic lens, which is interesting. However, when they plugged in the direct effects from the management itself, they actually found much stronger direct effects. And that's represented by bigger, bolder lines here from the management to the taxonomic diversity. And again, you can see these management effects were positive in some cases and negative in other cases. And what we see here is that age of planting was really important driver of animal diversity. Time since fire was also important, bison grazing, marginally important. And when you look at animals through that phylogenetic lens, it's a similar story. Some impacts through plant diversity, strong impacts through management from age and grazing. And in fact, if you add up these different effect sizes, the management-driven effect sizes were quite a bit stronger, larger than the plant-driven effect sizes. So to answer their questions, how does prairie restoration affect animal biodiversity? Management had both positive and negative effects, and that's to be expected. There's some trade-offs in management. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with thinking about a landscape where you can mix and match management approaches and have habitats that support multiple different types of animals across the big landscape scale. And their secondary question, I would actually amend that to say that management practices and plant biodiversity were important in structuring animal communities. But those management practices had a really strong effect, and that was a really interesting take home from these data. So at Nachusa, the work continues. We are continuing data collection for long-term plant monitoring, including younger plantings where our reconstruction techniques have changed over time as we've learned lessons. We now tend to plant with a more species diverse mix, fewer grasses in that mix. We're also continuing to collect data around the bison reintroduction. And like I said, I hope maybe in another 5 years, I can come back and talk about 10 years of bison responses on the landscape. And of course, we continue the conservation and restoration work. We do new plantings, new reconstructions every year. We're continuing to improve habitat in savanna areas and to combat invasive species in all of these places. Science is really gaining its stride at Nachusa and working side by side with the management and conservation work. The past few years, we've been supporting about 40 different researchers from 16 different institutions to do projects at Nachusa Grasslands. So far, Nachusa data has been included in 73 peer-reviewed publications, 11 of which were published in 2022. We celebrate with an annual science symposium, and this spring in April, we're really excited to return to an in-person format for that after 3 years of virtual meetings. And the Friends of Nachusa, which is an additional nonprofit organization that supports our work here at Nachusa Grasslands, have really invested in funding science. And for the 2023 field season, they've awarded $73,000 across 15 different researchers for projects that will be happening this coming field season at Nachusa. It's an honor to work with all of these people and with the Nature Conservancy in Illinois and the Friends of Nachusa Grasslands. I'm really delighted to be in this space and to contribute in what ways I can. And with that, I would be happy to take questions from the audience and discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. There are some questions I'll go through, and then of course, if anybody has any other questions or needs to clarify something, we can you can unmute yourself and ask. And then also, Amanda and I will respond to some folks in the chat. Seems like some folks couldn't see the slides, but others did. So not sure what was going on there. But there's so sorry about those technical glitches.
Sorry, team.
So Karen asks, I'm sorry if I missed it, but were the planted prairies only seeded once, that is never interseeded with additional species? So I guess, yeah, just that background question. Elizabeth, how was Nachusa planted?
That's a really good question, and I did kind of gloss over that. I didn't dive in very deep. So Nachusa plantings, that approach has evolved a little bit over time, but typically we go into a harvested cornfield, sometimes it's beans, but a harvested ag field, and spread these seeds out. And in the early days, these are small fields, and there was a small seed source available, so it was largely hand broadcast. But over time, we've really ramped up. And so you saw in the one photo, the trucks with the old school seed spreaders pulled behind them. That's how we typically plant our ag fields nowadays. Many plantings do get some interseeding. It really depends on how they come in. So especially those early plantings where everyone was still kind of learning how to do it, they tended to have a lot of grass in them. Most of those have received some interseeding over the years, and we actually have records of all of that. If anyone's really interested, you can actually go to the Nachusa Grasslands website. We have a planting report for almost every single planting we've done. Some of those early ones, we don't have as much information, but you can look up any planting report from any year and get a sense of what we're doing and how those techniques have evolved. So some of them do. Some of our newer plantings, we haven't necessarily done interseeding because they've come in really well and we've been pleased with the results. And I'll be honest, we've had some plantings at Nachusa that we just really struggled with invasive ag weeds, and we turned them back into cornfields for several years and then tried again from scratch. So it kind of varies a little bit from planting to planting, but generally they're getting, especially nowadays, they're consistently getting a seeding mixture of 150 different species usually. We're usually doing a 60% forb to 30% grass or 40% grass, either 60-40 or 70-30 kind of mix on the on the forb to grass ratio. And plant in the fall, usually November, December, and let it go from there.
Thank you, Elizabeth. There's another question. You might have answered it, but I'm gonna for fairness, I'm gonna go ahead and read it. So John asked, in planted prairies, were the number of species and species composition similar or the same across all planted units in references to seed mix?
Yeah, and the data I showed you, yes, they are pretty similar, in part because that data is some of our older plantings. Those plantings kind of done in the 90s probably are less species diverse than what we're planting now, but probably 70, 80, 100 species. Nowadays, we're doing more like 150 species. But in terms of that data, those plantings really did receive pretty similar seeding mixes and ratios and how they were planted. So that is a pretty fair apples to apples comparison. Someday, when I have more data, I'll write a paper where I bring in our newer plantings and talk about the evolution of management over time. But I don't have enough data to write that one yet.
Well, we'll look forward to that. That's right. Always
I feel like I'm putting things on my to-do list. Maybe I shouldn't have done that.
more data, more time, right? As we continue to learn and evolve and plant better prairies, or at least plant prairies that meet our management goals and objectives. Karen asks, it seems like there were negative impacts on invertebrates for most factors. Is there an explanation for that?
Yeah, so to clarify, in this study, the animal study, they were only looking at ground beetles and dung beetles. So this is not all invertebrates altogether. I probably should have clarified that, and I didn't. So these are ground crawling insects, and it's just the beetles that were included in this data set. And the nuance behind what's actually happening there is that the bison grazing was increasing dung beetles. Not unexpected. Time since fire was a really important role for beetles. And so we see the beetle community, there's some shifts between kind of functional groups of beetles, depending on, is it the year after a fire? Is it, 2 years after a fire? Some of that. And so what we're seeing with the beetles is that, they're shifting around the landscape of Nachusa following management disturbances like fire and grazing. And so kind of the overall landscape, community diversity and all of that are, kind of sustaining themselves. And the negative interactions that you were seeing were in response to like the year after a fire or the introduction of the bison, and that then other community members are filling back in as you extend time since fire, or they're thriving in the non-bison grazing units. So hopefully that's helpful. It's just looking at ground beetles and dung beetles.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And go ahead, Karen, if hopefully that answers your question, or at least gets you on the right path. Oh, very good. Thank you. So Stephen asked, what type of grazing system was used during the study?
Yeah, so the bison have free access to 1,500 acres of the prairie. They choose where they want to go on that 1,500 acres. They graze where they want to graze. We don't shift them around paddocks or constrain their grazing in any sort of way. Nachusa Grasslands as a whole, there's like another 2,500 acres where the bison don't have any access. And so in the animal study, they're contrasting the 1,500 acres where the bison are versus areas where the bison are not. That's the bison, no bison comparison in the animal study. In the plant study I talked about, we actually built those little fences within the bison unit. So we were comparing literally next to each other, access to grazing, no access to grazing. But we don't actually influence their movements in any way.
Elizabeth, as you reported, looking at the differences in the, in the native prairies versus the planted prairies, right? You noted lower plant diversity, conservatism in the planted versus native. So I'm just wondering what's lacking in the planted prairies versus the native prairies. Is it a few species? Is it dozens of species? I mean, are there, what's the magnitude of those differences? And then also the challenges to management if the goal is to bring the planted prairies closer to looking like native prairies?
Yeah, so yeah, those are some really good questions. And I'll kind of try and work my way through them the best I can. So in terms of what's missing, I think one of the big important take-homes is actually that our native prairie remnants are really different from each other. And so, the prairie remnant over here, it has species that we don't see on the prairie remnant over here. And those of us that work here are kind of like, oh yeah, if you want to find that population of like green milkweed, well, you go to that remnant and it's not on any of the others. If you want prairie smoke, you go to that remnant, it's not on any of the others. So my starting point in answering this question is recognizing that our remnants look incredibly different from each other. And that creates a much broader envelope of like what a remnant would look like, right? Like we actually don't have like a tight constrained knowledge of that because our remnants look really different from each other. And so in answer to that question of like what's missing, there isn't actually like consistent species that are like, oh, these are always in the remnants and never in the reconstructions. Now, a few of those examples would actually be something like prairie bush clover, federally endangered. That one is not in the reconstruction. That one's only in the remnants.
What about like Talinum or something? Or
oh, you're gonna have to help me out with Talinum. I don't know that one.
Okay, I'll ask offline another time.
Okay, that's all right. So the thing that makes the remnants distinctive are some of these particularly rare native plants, and those tend to have very high C values that push that C value up. And some of those, like, something like prairie bush clover, because it's federally threatened, there's constraints on, we can't, we're not just going to move that one around necessarily. That being said, yeah, so there aren't necessarily plants that like really jump out. Certainly when you're on a remnant, you see a lot of things like lead plant. And it's not that we don't have lead pit in the reconstructions, it just doesn't, it's not as much of it and it doesn't pop out the same way it does on the remnants. I also flagged that our remnants at Nachusa are all on sandy hilltops, and most of our reconstructions are in lower, more clay-rich soil. In part, that's the soil that grew corn better, and so that was the soil that got plowed up and turned into corn. So historically, there probably were some fundamental differences between these hilltops and like that interconnecting lowlands, but I don't know. Some of that is probably just lost information. So in short, the work that I've done, I've not been able to find like, here's the 10 species we always see in remnants that we don't see in restorations. It hasn't been as clear cut as that. I feel like there was another part of your question I got excited about, and now I've forgotten what it was. It was about the like getting the reconstructions to look like native prairie remnants. And I would say, I try to be careful. I'm not sure that our management goal is for the reconstructions to look like the remnants. Our goal is for the reconstructions to support a high level of plant diversity, to function well, to support animal diversity, and to recognize that these prairies exist today in 2023. And we're not trying to reconstruct a historical postcard. We're trying to put together a thriving native community that can respond to changes and challenges that weren't present, even 50 years ago. The pressure from invasive honeysuckle today is, even is orders of magnitude different than it was even in 93 when a lot of this work started. So there's challenges like that we just were aware of, and we recognize these systems are moving forward in time and they're not static. We certainly want to see those rare native plants find homes, and move beyond those remnant habitats. And we want to support that. But I think I'm personally comfortable that the reconstructions don't have to identically match those remnants.
Very good. Thank you so much for a very thorough answer. There are some other questions come up in the chat. Brandon asked, any idea on the impact of the number of person hours on the outcome of restorations? There would be that volunteer force at Nachusa Grasslands.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's 2 ways to approach that. One is we have in recent years started tracking our management using some ArcGIS maps maps and apps. Field maps is what we're currently using, and we're actually measuring. When our seasonal field crew goes out, they draw a polygon. We swept the weeds in this area, and it took us 2 hours, and there were 6 of us, and we used 2 gallons of herbicide. So we're tracking all of that information, and we're just starting to kind of build enough of a data set that we're being able to see, like, okay, are we, by putting effort in this area, are we actually seeing improvement over time? And how can we use our person hours efficiently? How can we use our resources efficiently to manage 4,000 acres? So that's something that we're starting to get to a point where we have data to really think about and talk about that. And we've been collecting it the same way now for 4 or 5 years. The other angle on that is that Nachusa would not be the place it is without some incredibly dedicated volunteers. And I love any opportunity to give them a really big shout out. We really benefit from folks who are engaged to the point that, we kind of give them their own unit and they're in charge, and they do their own plantings, they do their own weed management, and that buy-in really keeps them coming back. We have other volunteers that get excited about particular tasks. We currently have a brush whacker team that's been going after honeysuckle in areas. So we're really trying to be welcoming and recognize we couldn't do it without those volunteers. But you're right. Those people hours, there's a lot of people hours that go into this work.
Yeah, those data are going to be really great to share across the community once that gets compiled. So thanks, Elizabeth. Amanda asked, do you have a sense of the % of planted species that came up in the plantings?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I was kind of getting at that with that proportion of native species. But of course, there's volunteer native species that, we don't plant that are, kind of ruderal. I'm actually going to, I may reshare the slide. I'm going to go back so I don't say something completely off base here. Planted prairie. Yeah, so here, maybe I will, oh no. Let me see if I can share this real quick. So with planted prairie, our proportion of native species is more like, 60 to 75%. So that's what we're getting at with native species. Now, that may or may not exactly be what was planted, but that's a pretty good approximation of what we're getting. Yeah, that would include, I'm trying to think of like a good example of what that would include. Something like a weedy thistle that's native, that's like just comes in on its own, or maybe common milkweed, Clepeus syriaca. That would be one that we don't plant it. It comes in just fine on its own.
Very good. Thanks. Thank you, Elizabeth. Oh, okay. Another question from Karen, that is hopefully going to be right in your wheelhouse. Have you been doing any soil biodiversity research comparing the planted prairies versus remnants, and do you have any fun results to highlight? I know Elizabeth likes to talk about the soil biota.
I do. Yeah, I did realize you said, yeah, in my introduction, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm not actually talking about soil in this particular talk. Yes, that is something we're working on. I have some fingers in that fire, but there's also other great researchers out here who are working on those questions as well. I have some older data that also included Nachusa that actually reinforces what we're seeing from the plant community when you look at fungal communities and bacterial communities, which is that the remnants are actually pretty distinct from each other. Once again, we're getting a pretty big spread across those remnants. The reconstructions look more similar to each other in terms of that below ground community. And there's heavy overlap, but there is still some distinction. And from that soil perspective, I also looked at some assays of their functionality. How well do they degrade carbon and nitrogen? And what we found is that despite these community differences in the fungal and the bacteria, functionally, at least for carbon cycling, they were very similar between the remnants and the reconstructions. Nitrogen cycling was a little higher in the, like organic nitrogen cycling was higher in the remnants, and we saw more kind of that inorganic nitrogen legacy in the reconstructions. But that's the most current data set that I've got from that, but it is something we're working on. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you. Looks like Katrina responded to Karen in the chat. Talking about some of the research going on at Nachusa Grasslands. Well, we have reached the end of our time, and I sincerely thank Elizabeth Bach for her presentation and knowledge and skills and expertise when it comes to prairie reconstruction. And I want to thank all of you for being here with us today. We have a couple more online events, at least we as in the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative. Next week, actually over 2 mornings next week, February 15th and 16th, we're going to have a virtual field day talking about bison and fire and prairie reconstruction. And I'll send out a reminder to our Prairie Reconstruction Initiative email list. And then join us back here on Wednesday, February 22nd at 1 p.m. Central Time for Justin Meissen from the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa, where he'll talk about some really great research he's doing with restoring prairie plant communities. So with that, thanks again, and we'll sign off. So thanks again, Elizabeth.
Thank you all.
Okay, and thank you, Becky.